The envelope waited for me on the counter, cream-colored and heavy, the kind of paper that wanted to announce its own importance. I noticed it the second I walked into the apartment, still wearing my boots from morning drills, dust drying on the laces. The air smelled faintly of detergent and iron, the usual mixture that followed me home from the base. I had not even set down my bag when my eyes caught the gold seal glinting beneath the kitchen light. I froze. It should not have been there, not in this apartment that I had built carefully, piece by piece, to be mine and mine alone. Here, everything was functional, stripped of decoration, steel counters, simple wooden stools, white walls without photographs. And yet there it sat, loud in its silence, like a guest that had let itself in without knocking. I did not touch it at first. Old habits told me to wait, to observe. We were trained not to lunge at things we could not immediately read. In a war zone, rushing at the wrong signal could cost you more than a moment's mistake. So I studied it. No return address, no personal note, just my name, scrawled in a font so ornate it looked mass-produced. Miss Journey Pratt. The misspelling burned more than I expected. One letter gone, one letter twisted, and suddenly I was someone else entirely. A mistake at best, an erasure at worst. My mother had given me the name Journey deliberately, to remind me that survival was movement, that to keep going meant to keep existing. To see it stripped down into something careless made my chest tighten in ways I did not want to admit. It could have been an error from a printer, a clerk's oversight. But in my family, such things were never errors. They were choices. I slid a thumb beneath the flap and opened it carefully, the way I would have opened a sealed briefing in the field. Do not tear. Do not rush. Know what is inside before you expose it. The cardstock was thick, edges pressed with an embossed floral pattern. The lettering inside glimmered in gold. Charlotte and Jonathan request the honor of your presence. I read the lines 3 times, each pass heavier than the last. The words beneath spelled out the details. Saturday, 5 in the evening, family estate, formal garden attire. At the bottom, written in cursive that looked delicate and poisonous all at once, it read, "We cannot wait to celebrate with all who matter most. All who matter most." The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence as though it wanted to underline the insult. I set the card down on the counter, beside a stack of mission reports I had been meaning to file. NATO briefings. Maps annotated with field notes. Words stamped classified in red. Documents that had once shaped outcomes I could not even speak of outside secure rooms. And now here I was, holding a piece of cardboard that told me plainly that I did not matter in my own family's house. The contrast was almost absurd. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed the one number I always trusted. Sarah answered on the first ring. "You got it," she said immediately, her voice steady and low, the way it always was when she knew I was on the edge of saying something I might regret. "They used the wrong name again," I told her. My voice came out flatter than I intended, like a soldier reading coordinates. There was a pause, the kind that stretches just long enough to remind you the other person is weighing every word. "They did not forget," Sarah said. "They erased." The word cracked something in me. Erased. That was the truth of it, wasn't it? My family had never stumbled or slipped. They had deliberately cropped me out, like trimming a photograph until I became nothing more than a shoulder and a shadow. "You don't owe them a thing," she continued, softer now. I exhaled, the sound more like a protest than a breath. "I know. You gave them 20 years of silence, Journey. That is more than they ever gave you." I let my eyes drift to the uniform hanging in the narrow closet by the kitchen. Pressed, perfect, waiting. The insignia gleamed faintly where the kitchen light hit it. That uniform had seen deserts, storms, the broken edges of humanity, and it had carried me through every one of them. It had never failed me, but they had. "Do you think I should go?" I asked. "You already know the answer." I smiled faintly despite myself. Sarah never wasted words, she never played at comfort when truth would do. "Yeah, I'm going." "Then go on your terms, not theirs." I ended the call, slid the phone back onto the counter, and moved toward the closet. My fingers touched the fabric of the dress blues, traced the weight of metals and stripes that had cost more than they had ever wanted to know. For a heartbeat, I pictured walking into the house wearing it all, forcing them to see what they had ignored. To see not the forgotten sister, but the commander who had led rooms of men twice her size. To see what silence had built. But I let the fantasy fade. Recognition that must be forced is not recognition at all. I folded the uniform with care and placed it back on the hanger. Instead, I reached for the plain navy dress at the far end of the rack. Civilian, quiet, unremarkable. They did not deserve to see me in what I had earned. I laid the dress across the bed, then sat beside it, elbows resting on my knees. My chest felt heavy, but my pulse remained steady, the way it always did before walking into a place I did not trust. The phone buzzed again. A message from Sarah lit the screen. "She probably put you next to the caterers." I almost laughed, the kind of laugh that cuts more than it heals. "Of course she did," I murmured into the quiet. I rose, grabbed my coat, slid the envelope into my pocket, and whispered to the room, "Let them underestimate me. They always do." The drive north stretched longer than memory. The road was lined with hedges clipped so evenly it was as though someone had measured each leaf with a ruler. By the time the estate came into view, twilight was settling. The mansion stood tall against the horizon, glowing with curated perfection. From a distance, it looked like a painting. Up close, it looked like a stage set, every detail polished into sterility. I parked at the edge of the gravel driveway. For a moment, I sat in the car, hands still gripping the steering wheel. The engine ticked as it cooled, the sound sharp in the evening quiet. The house loomed, windows lit in gold, but none of it felt like home. I checked the mirror. My face stared back, calm, unreadable, trained. No sign of hesitation, no hint of the weight I carried in my chest. I stepped out. Gravel crunched beneath my shoes, every sound louder than it should have been. The hedges rustled faintly in the breeze, perfect lines bending just slightly, as though even nature itself was forced to obey here. By the time I reached the door, it opened without my hand touching the bell. Marilyn stood there, framed by marble and light. She wore a silk blouse that shimmered under the chandelier, her smile airbrushed into place like it had been painted on. In her hand, a half-empty glass of rosé. "You came," she said, voice smooth as the wine she swirled. "How brave." Brave. The word tasted bitter in my mouth. I had walked into places where every corner might hold a rifle aimed at my head, places where silence was a matter of life and death. And yet here, at this doorway, facing a woman who had never seen a battlefield, the word brave felt heavier. "I got in early," I said evenly. "Did not want to miss anything." Her eyes flicked over me like she was scanning for flaws. "The florist is late. Maybe you can help Charlotte with the centerpieces." I nodded once. Automatic. The soldier in me always said yes to tasks, even when the civilian in me wanted to throw the glass in her hand against the marble floor. As I stepped inside, the scent of hydrangeas and polished stone wrapped around me like a net. The house was perfect, immaculate, and suffocating. The battle had already begun. Marble swallowed my footsteps as I entered the foyer. The chandelier above me looked like a frozen constellation, every crystal catching light that felt colder the longer I stood beneath it. On the entry table sat a framed photograph of Charlotte and Jonathan, both of them tan and polished, her hand resting on his chest like a signature. Beside the frame, a small brass plaque announced a line about gratitude being the mark of grace. It made me think of public relations campaigns and careful captions, not grace. A young woman in black hurried past with a tray of glassware. She paused when she saw me, eyes flicking to the simple dress I wore, and pointed toward the back of the house. "Staff staging is through the sunroom," she said. Then she rushed away before I could correct her. I kept walking. 2 steps later, Marilyn clicked after me on pointed heels and touched my elbow with the softness people use when they want to move you without being seen doing it. "This way," she said. "We tucked your seat near the kitchen door. It will be easier if you want to help." If I want to help. I nodded once and followed the curve of the hallway. Hydrangeas in enormous vases lined the route like border checkpoints. The farther we went, the more the house turned into a diagram only Charlotte would understand. Rooms had names instead of purposes. Library, music, garden salon, sunroom. Every one of them gleamed with the kind of polish that keeps fingerprints from staying. We reached a glass-walled room where sunlight fought its way through veils of white drapery. Charlotte sat at a table strewn with ribbons, her back very straight, a phone pressed to her ear. The voice she used in public had a special brightness. She was using it now. "Of course," she said, twining a lavender ribbon around a bundle of silverware. "Authenticity is our theme." She hung up and looked at me without surprise. "You made it. Would not miss it." Her gaze skimmed my dress. "Sensible," she said. "That is always your style." She gestured toward a printed seating chart, a grid that broke the evening into rows and circles. My name sat at the edge of the arrangement near a small arrow that pointed toward a service corridor. "Perfect," I said. Charlotte smiled the way people smile when they do not want to show their teeth. "We saved the East Wing for out-of-town family. There are gift baskets in all the suites. Yours is next to the garage, so you will not be disturbed." I thanked her as if the word did not taste strange. Guests began to arrive as the light deepened outside. Door chimes rang at measured intervals like a metronome for ambition. I recognized a few faces from old holidays and a few more from news articles. Marilyn floated from greeting to greeting, offering touches on wrists and compliments shaped like tiny hooks. Conversation rose to a hum and settled at a higher frequency that never broke, the sound of people confirming one another. A man thrust a tray of champagne toward me. I took 2 flutes. It would have been easy to stay on the edge and let the evening flow around me, a smooth river avoiding a rock it refused to acknowledge, but I was tired of being the rock. I stepped into the current. "Journey," Marilyn called, appearing at my shoulder with the timing of a rehearsed cue. "Would you mind taking these to the patio bar? The staff is short 2 runners. It would be a huge help." She had already placed a wooden tray in my hands. Both flutes chimed softly as the stems bumped together. I felt my jaw tighten and made myself inhale slowly through my nose. Do the task, choose the reason. I carried the drinks to the patio bar and set them down where a bartender with sleeves rolled to his elbows was carving curls of lemon peel. "Thanks," he said without looking up. Then he glanced at my face and straightened. "Sorry, I thought you were with us." "I know," I almost smiled. "Apparently I am tonight." I turned back toward the house and moved through clusters of guests who parted without noticing they had done so. The dress was doing its job, invisible when I wanted it. I used the freedom to study the room the way I would study a map, points of entry, lines of sight, who watched whom when they thought no one was paying attention. Pressure gathers in a crowd like weather. "Excuse me," a woman in a gold dress said as I passed. "Are you military admin or support services or something like that?" I paused. "Strategic operations." Her smile flickered. "So files that decide where people stand when the first shot is fired," I said gently. She blinked once, twice, then turned toward the cheese display as if it had called her name. I took another lap through the room. My father stood near the fireplace speaking to a man whose suit fit him like obligation. Dad's hands made small chopping motions when he talked, a habit I knew well from kitchen table arguments when I was 17 and thought facts could outlast volume. He had not aged as much as I expected, or maybe I had aged more than he had. His gaze slid past me once, skittered, then moved on again as though he had seen a reflection in a window and convinced himself it was a trick of light. At the far end of the room, I stopped. Jonathan had entered without noise. He wore a dark suit that did not need to be expensive to look like authority. He had the posture of someone who learned to measure the ground before he stepped on it. People were already angling their bodies toward him in small increments, eager to be caught in his orbit. Charlotte reached him first and took his arm. He smiled down at her with the ease of a man who had trained for attention. When his eyes lifted, they found mine. For a heartbeat, we regarded one another across a river of glass and flowers. I felt nothing dramatic, no lurch in my chest, no cinematic swell. Only recognition, strange and precise. He inclined his head a fraction, not a greeting exactly, more a notation, like marking a coordinate on a map. Then a couple drew him into a story about where they had sourced a certain olive oil, and the moment broke. "Journey." Sarah's voice arrived at my shoulder like the first clean breath after smoke. I turned and found her half smiling, hair pulled back, a plain black dress making her look like the only unadorned thing in the room. She had never belonged here and did not care. "You said you could not make it," I whispered. "I said I might be late." She handed me a bottle of sparkling water and moved her eyes across the room with the efficiency of a sweep. "You good?" "I am here," I said. "That is the first part. And the second part, not letting them decide the rest." Sarah squeezed my arm once and drifted away, leaving a wake of steadiness behind her. I sipped the water and let the edges of my focus soften. Conversations rose and fell like small tides. Laughter bloomed on cue. Cameras flashed, then reset, searching for a perfect angle on an unblemished night. A woman lifted her phone and aimed it in my direction. The screen brightened my face in miniature. A second later, she lowered the device and tapped twice. Delete. I watched her thumb ride the gesture with casual certainty, then looked back toward the windows where daylight was thinning into a color the house did not know how to stage. A staff door near the kitchen swung open. For a moment, I could see the spine of the operation. Trays lined up like chess pieces, a clipboard with notes about timing, a young server leaning against the wall, eyes closed, breathing as if she had run a mile. I remembered that breath from other lives. The breath you take when you are trying to slow your heart before stepping into a room that expects you to be effortless. I stepped closer and held the door. She startled, met my eyes, and then straightened. "You are good," I said quietly. "You have got this." She nodded and slipped past me, balancing a tray that shook only once before she steadied it. Back in the main hall, a small applause rolled through the crowd. Charlotte stood near the floral arch, pale green silk catching the last light. She lifted a glass and thanked everyone for their support, their guidance, their belief in love. The words were polished smooth from use. People beamed as if they heard them for the first time. Jonathan listened without interrupting, his attention disciplined. His gaze drifted only once, a flicker that landed on me and steadied before returning to the script of the evening. I found my seat near the kitchen door, just as Marilyn promised. It had a clean view of almost everything and a clean view of nothing that mattered. Useful for a person who notices, useless for a person who wants to be seen. I set my hands on my lap and watched as a server poured wine with elegant precision, never letting a drop fall. The room performed contentment. Underneath, a tremor moved like pressure beneath a fault line. Dad approached, wineglass in hand, wearing the smile he used when introductions might lead to opportunities. He stopped when he realized it was me. "Journey," he said, as if trying the name again after years of not using it. "You are here." "I am," I said. He lifted his glass slightly and searched my face as if he might find a sentence there to finish whatever thought he had begun. "Charlotte has done well," he said instead. "I told her all she needed was focus." I nodded. We stood in that familiar space where conversation was a narrow hallway with locked doors on both sides. He cleared his throat, glanced toward the arch, and then back at me. "You look well," he added. "I am well," I said. He looked relieved, as though he had solved something, and moved on toward a man in a bold tie. I watched him go and felt the old ache prick, not sharp, just present. The ache of a person who never asked because he did not want to hear an answer that did not match his plan. Time thinned. Servers moved like choreography. Guests drifted toward the dining room. On the way, I passed the gallery wall that had been curated to chronicle a single version of our family. Charlotte in a valedictorian sash. Charlotte breaking a ribbon at a half marathon. Charlotte at a podium, hand raised to accept a wave of applause that had been waiting for her even before she spoke. I scanned the frames and found slivers of myself in a few edges. A shoulder, a strand of hair, an elbow that looked like it might belong to anyone. At the far end of the hallway, a staircase turned upward into shadow. It was not part of the tour. The house had angles it did not put on display. I let my eyes rest there for a breath, filing the curve of the banister and the way the carpet wore down in the center, where feet had passed more often than the cleaning schedule admitted. A draft crept down from the landing and touched my ankle like a whisper. Then the doors to the dining room opened and light poured out like a stage rising. A string quartet shifted to a warmer key. People filed in with the practiced ease of those who were sure of their place. I took my seat near the service entrance. The chair felt smaller than it looked. The first course arrived. Conversation flowed around me. I watched and listened and allowed the quiet to settle on my shoulders like a cloak I had chosen. Under the noise of cutlery and laughter, under the hum of a night designed to confirm itself, I felt it again. The tremor. The house held its breath the way people do before they say a thing that cannot be taken back. I lifted my water glass, the surface still and bright, and made myself a promise in clean internal words. Stay present, note everything. When the ground shifts, step where your training tells you. When the script cracks, let it crack. I set the glass down. Across the room, Jonathan touched his breast pocket as if making sure something remained where he had placed it. His eyes rose and found mine for the second time that night. He did not smile. He did not look away. I looked past him toward the staircase that waited beyond the gallery wall. I did not know yet what the house had hidden. I only knew the feeling of a door about to give beneath a hand. The chandelier chimed softly as the air moved. Someone laughed too loudly and then pretended they had not. A fork scraped porcelain like a small alarm. I breathed in once, deep and even, and let the evening carry us forward. The dining room glittered as though it had been polished for inspection. Chandeliers hummed with light. Long tables stretched across the room, clothed in white and lined with cutlery arranged like surgical tools. Every chair had been placed at perfect angles. I took mine quietly at the edge, near the swinging door where servers slipped in and out with the rhythm of an assembly line. I was meant to be background. That was the point of seating me. The room filled quickly. Men in tailored suits checked the shine of their cufflinks. Women leaned toward one another with laughter pitched high enough to be heard, but not so loud as to break the illusion of refinement. Their perfume mingled with the hydrangeas, a mixture sweet enough to sting. I watched the procession like an outsider at a parade. Charlotte floated into the room wearing pale silk, her posture as precise as the lines of the hedges outside. She guided Jonathan at her side like she was leading him into a spotlight. He wore authority the way other men wore ties, natural and unforced. People angled toward them without realizing they were doing it. "Jonathan," someone called. "Congratulations, you found the perfect partner." Charlotte smiled as though she had written the script herself. She lifted her glass, acknowledged the praise, then allowed Jonathan to answer only with a nod. The choreography was flawless. I sipped water, the glass cool in my hand, and noted how the servers moved in silent coordination. Food arrived in small portions that looked too delicate to feed anyone, arranged into shapes that required explanation. Guests hummed with approval before even tasting. A woman leaned across the table, her pearls catching the chandelier light. "Journey, is it? I hear you work in administration for the military." I held her gaze. "Strategic operations," I said. Her smile flickered, uncertain. "So." Filing, I answered. "That decides which route a convoy takes and whether or not the convoy makes it home." Her fork paused midway to her mouth. She set it down with exaggerated care, turned back to her neighbor, and asked about his garden instead. Charlotte's laughter rang from the center of the room. She was retelling a story from her college days, one where she triumphed in a debate competition. She added a flourish, imitating her opponent's panic, and everyone laughed with her. Jonathan's expression remained polite but distant. He glanced down the table once and his eyes brushed mine. Recognition again. A small signal no one else saw. My father stood near the far end, already warming himself with his second glass of wine. His cheeks were flushed, his smile rehearsed. He spotted me and gave a small wave as though I were an acquaintance from work he had not expected to see. No one else noticed. By the time the main course arrived, my usefulness had been assumed. A guest gestured toward a stack of folded napkins. "Would you mind handing those down?" Another asked if I could adjust a vase that leaned slightly off-center. I complied without protest. That was how I had survived most of my life, by completing tasks no one else wanted to notice. Quiet competency was my camouflage, but I was not furniture, and furniture does not notice patterns in the room. Through the veil of chatter, I tracked movements the way I used to track signals. Jonathan shifted his seat subtly whenever Charlotte's voice grew brighter. Marilyn refilled her glass before each toast, her smile stiffening with each swallow. Dad repeated his golf story twice to different groups, unaware that the same words had already passed through the room. The details did not matter to anyone else. They mattered to me, because silence stores evidence. A photographer entered, his camera flashing like small detonations. He moved guests into clusters near the archway of flowers, arranging them with cheerful authority. When he gestured toward me, Charlotte's hand lifted, delicate, redirecting his attention back to her circle. I stayed where I was, unbothered. I had been cropped out of photographs before. At some point, a tray of champagne was set near me. I distributed glasses down the row without being asked. One woman took hers without looking at me, another muttered thanks absent-mindedly. My hands were steady as they always were. Even here, dismissed and diminished, precision was a habit I would not break. The evening thickened with more wine, more practiced laughter, more small performances of family. I watched it all quietly, cataloging what others chose not to see. And then, almost without planning it, my eyes wandered toward the hallway that led back to the gallery wall. The staircase waited there, curving upward into shadow. I felt the pull of it, the sense that something unscripted lingered beyond the reach of the chandeliers. The tremor beneath the night grew stronger. I placed my glass down carefully and stood. No one noticed. They were not meant to. The gallery wall stretched across the hallway like an exhibition of a single life. Frame after frame, Charlotte's face glowed in curated light. Valedictorian sash, marathon ribbon, a handshake with a senator whose name I could not remember. Each image was chosen carefully, as though the family had agreed that only her milestones deserved a place in gold leaf. I moved slowly, my shoes sinking into the thick carpet. My own presence appeared only in fragments, half a shoulder here, a strand of hair there. A mistake too small to be erased but too inconvenient to be acknowledged. I stopped in front of one particular photograph, her Harvard graduation. She stood in the center, radiant in crimson, Dad beside her with his arm raised in pride. Marilyn hovered with a graceful smile, and behind them, barely visible, a sliver of my hair had slipped into the edge of the frame. I leaned in until the glass reflected my face alongside the cropped image. For a second, it looked as if I were standing beside them. Then I blinked, and the illusion disappeared. A faint draft stirred the air. The staircase curved upward just beyond the last frame. It was unlit, carpet worn thin in the center, the kind of detail only noticed by someone trained to see wear patterns. I listened. The hum of conversation in the dining room masked any sound I might make. Without hesitating, I set a hand on the banister and climbed. The second floor smelled of lemon polish and old wood. Light from the chandeliers below bled only halfway up, leaving shadows pooled in corners. The air was cooler here. Fewer voices reached this far. I passed a row of closed doors, their handles gleaming, their silence heavy. At the end of the hallway, one door stood ajar. Inside, the guest room was neat but unremarkable. A narrow bed covered in white linen. A dresser with one drawer slightly open. I nudged it wider with my knuckle. Inside lay forgotten odds and ends, a cracked hairbrush, faded holiday cards, a roll of ribbon that had lost its sheen. And then, wrapped in a napkin, a thin silver bracelet. My breath caught. I picked it up, turned it in my fingers. The small compass charm was bent at the clasp, initials faint from years of wear. My initials, Journey, the bracelet I had lost when I was a child, the one I had cried for until my throat ached. Dad had told me it was gone, probably lost in the woods during summer camp. But here it was, tarnished but intact, hidden away in a drawer labeled as junk. They had not thrown it away. They had hidden it. I sat on the edge of the bed, the bracelet pressing cold into my palm. The ache inside me deepened, not sharp enough to bleed but heavy enough to crush. It was proof of something I had always suspected but never said aloud. Their erasure was deliberate. I slipped it into my pocket and stood, my pulse steadying with each breath. A small cardboard box sat in the closet corner, marked with black ink. Journey junk. I knelt and lifted the lid. Inside were fragments of a life they had stored away. A sketch I had drawn as a teenager, a medal from middle school, a folded page of notes written in my own hand during early training. My handwriting precise and hurried. Operation Cold Moon draft, I froze. I remembered the night I wrote it. 36 hours without sleep, satellite feeds burning into my eyes, guilt gnawing at me after an ambush. I had written the report in a fog, convinced I had failed, convinced it was not worth submitting. Yet here it was, tucked in a box of discards, preserved without explanation. My fingers brushed the margin. Words written not by me, but in a sharper, angled hand. This saved us. The breath left my lungs in a rush. I knew that handwriting, military tight, disciplined, Jonathan. Heat surged in my chest. The man now tied to my sister, the man whose name glowed on invitations, had once leaned on my report to survive. My report. My calculations, my judgment in the dark. The sound of laughter drifted faintly from downstairs, oblivious. I pressed the page against my chest, the bracelet heavy in my pocket. The house might have buried me in shadows, but its walls still carried evidence. The tremor beneath the evening sharpened. The ground was shifting. I folded the paper carefully, slid it back into the box, and closed the lid. My reflection in the mirror above the dresser looked steadier than I felt. Calm eyes, straight posture. The face of someone prepared for war, even when the battlefield looked like a dining room. Footsteps echoed faintly down the hallway. I slipped from the room and returned to the stairs before anyone noticed. By the time I re-entered the dining hall, no one had registered my absence. They were too busy laughing at Charlotte's story, too busy arranging themselves into photographs they thought would last forever. I took my seat at the edge, hands folded in my lap. The bracelet pressed against my thigh, the memory of Jonathan's handwriting burned behind my eyes. I did not smile. I did not raise my glass. But I knew, with certainty, that silence would not protect them forever. The bracelet pressed against my palm the entire next day, its weight small but relentless. I carried it like contraband, checking my pocket as though someone might suddenly demand to see what I had no right to hold. Each time I touched it, I felt younger, smaller, like the child who had wept for it once and been told to stop clinging to things that did not matter. Now I knew the truth. They had taken it, not lost it. Hidden it, not discarded it. The silver compass still pointed north, though the arrow trembled when I tilted it. Maybe that was fitting. I had always known the direction, even when they had tried to convince me I did not. The house stirred early the next morning. Servants shifted between kitchens and gardens, preparing for the rehearsal dinner. Guests wandered in bathrobes across manicured terraces. I walked the grounds before breakfast, unhurried, watching shadows stretch long across the clipped grass. The air smelled of lavender and expensive fertilizer. Every hedge was a wall, every tree trimmed into obedience. Beauty turned into control. When I returned inside, I passed the gallery again. A photographer was already at work, repositioning frames to capture them in softer light. Charlotte stood nearby, advising him on which pictures should be centered. She did not glance at me once. At the dining table, Jonathan sat with a laptop open, typing steadily while guests murmured around him. He looked less like a groom-to-be and more like a soldier in disguise, one who had not yet removed his uniform from his mind. When his eyes lifted and met mine, I recognized the sharpness behind them, the memory of handwriting. This saved us. He closed the laptop almost abruptly and gestured to the seat across from him. I hesitated, but no one else seemed to notice. I sat. "You wrote it," he said, his voice low enough not to carry. I kept my face neutral. "Wrote what?" "The cold moon assessment. It had your name in the metadata, your style in the analysis." For a moment, I wanted to deny it, to let the silence continue, but Jonathan's gaze held mine the way a compass needle holds north. He already knew. "Yes," I said. He exhaled softly, as if confirming something he had hoped. "That report saved 2 platoons. Without it, the extraction would have failed. Without it, I wouldn't be here." The words landed between us like iron. I did not answer immediately. Gratitude was dangerous in this family. It was a currency I had never been given. "You should not mention it here," I said finally, his brow furrowed. "Why?" "Because here, truth is a guest no one invited." A flicker of recognition crossed his face. He leaned back, adjusting his cuffs, slipping into the performance expected of him. From across the room, Charlotte called his name, bright as glass. Jonathan straightened, offered me the smallest nod, then rose to join her. I remained at the table, staring at the condensation ring his glass had left behind. Later that afternoon, I wandered the East Wing. The rehearsal dinner was hours away, and the house buzzed with staff rearranging flowers and polishing silver. The farther I moved from the main halls, the quieter it grew. The East Wing smelled different, dustier, less curated, as though the estate itself had forgotten to perform here. A narrow door stood half-hidden at the end of the corridor. Its knob turned easily beneath my hand. Inside was a small room with shelves stacked unevenly, filled with papers, boxes, things discarded without ceremony. I pulled a folder from the middle shelf. Inside were clippings of newspaper articles, Charlotte's competitions, Charlotte's interviews, Charlotte's awards. Between them, one headline stood out, folded and crumpled. A NATO operation report. Anonymous source credited for intelligence that had rerouted convoys. The article was dated the same week as my cold moon draft. My throat tightened. Someone had submitted my work, stripped of my name, and funneled the recognition elsewhere. I dropped the folder back into place, my hands suddenly restless. My pulse hammered against the bracelet in my pocket. Behind me, the floor creaked. I turned quickly. Jonathan stood in the doorway, shoulders squared, his expression unreadable. "You found it," he said quietly. "You knew?" I suspected. He stepped into the room, closing the door softly behind him. I had to keep it quiet. "There are politics you don't want to touch, but seeing you here, finding this, it confirms everything." I crossed my arms. "And what will you do with it?" Jonathan looked at me as though weighing his answer. His voice softened. "I will remember who saved me, even if they never will." The room fell silent. Dust motes drifted between us like suspended ash. Then a call echoed down the hall, Charlotte's voice again, sharp and expectant. Jonathan opened the door and left without another word. I remained, my hands pressed against the edge of the shelf until my knuckles whitened. The secrets were multiplying, weaving threads I had not yet seen, and all of them pointed to the same conclusion. This family had rewritten me out of their story. But stories, like battlefields, could be taken back. The rehearsal dinner would begin soon, and I would not remain silent forever. The rehearsal dinner began at dusk, when the air outside glowed with the last orange edges of daylight. Strings of lanterns stretched across the terrace, soft spheres of light swaying gently in the breeze. The garden had been transformed into a stage, every path lined with candles, every seat draped in cloth that matched Charlotte's dress. Guests gathered in clusters, glasses already filled, their voices rising in polite waves that crashed and receded like tides. I took my place near the far end of the long table, close to the hedges. From here I could watch without being watched, a vantage point I had learned to value long ago. The bracelet pressed against my wrist beneath the cuff of my sleeve. I had slipped it on before walking outside, kneading the metal against my skin even if no one else noticed. Charlotte floated among the guests, radiant and rehearsed, thanking people for traveling, complimenting dresses, praising speeches that had not yet been given. She paused near me once, her smile sharp as glass. "Try not to brood," she said lightly. "You are making the photographs too heavy." Then she drifted on before I could answer. Jonathan followed several steps behind her, pausing to shake hands, to nod, to offer measured words that sounded genuine enough to satisfy. But every so often, when he thought no one was looking, his eyes found mine. Just a flicker, quick and precise, like the pulse of a signal between operatives. Each time, my chest tightened with the knowledge of what we both carried and what we both knew must remain unsaid. The first toast came from Marilyn. She tapped her glass delicately and spoke of family as though the word had never been a knife. She described Charlotte as grace embodied, Jonathan as steadfastness incarnate, and together as proof that dreams can align when people believe enough. Applause rose like trained birds. I clapped too, my palms flat, the sound hollow in my own ears. The courses followed, one after another, each smaller than the last, each described in detail by a waiter who recited ingredients as though reading scripture. People nodded and murmured appreciation. I tasted little. My focus was elsewhere, on the tremor beneath the surface, the sense that the night was building toward something fragile. Halfway through the main course, a man across from me leaned forward. His tie was the color of rust, his cheeks flushed with wine. "You're Charlotte's sister, aren't you?" he asked, his voice thick but curious. "Yes. And you're in the military, logistics or admin, I heard?" I set my fork down carefully. "Operations analysis," he blinked. "Numbers and charts? Numbers and charts that determine where men live and where men die." The words left my mouth calmly, evenly, but they fell on the table like lead. For a moment, silence stretched across the plates. Then the man coughed, lifted his glass, and changed the subject to weather. Conversation resumed, louder than before, as though to cover what had been said. Charlotte glanced down the table, irritation flickering across her face. I had disrupted the choreography, even if only for a moment. Later, as dessert arrived, spheres of chocolate balanced on sugar glass, Jonathan excused himself from Charlotte's side and walked toward me. He stopped just behind my chair, his hand resting lightly on the back, the gesture casual enough to escape notice. "You should know," he murmured, "I've kept your report all these years, not just the notes, the original." I turned my head slightly. "Why?" "Because truth deserves a witness." Before I could answer, Charlotte called his name, her voice bright but sharp, pulling him back into orbit. He straightened, stepped away, and the moment vanished like a dropped signal. I stared down at the chocolate sphere in front of me, untouched. Its glossy surface reflected the lantern light, perfect and fragile. One touch of a spoon and it would shatter, spilling whatever was hidden inside. The metaphor was too neat, too clear. Around me, laughter rose, wine poured, silverware chimed. The night performed joy. But beneath the surface, secrets pressed against the shell, waiting for the strike that would crack it open. The bracelet warmed against my wrist as though it remembered the child who once believed she had lost it forever. I ran my thumb across the charm, steadying myself. Let them perform. Let them laugh. Let them drink. When the time came, the truth would speak without needing permission. And the truth, I knew, was patient. Morning light slid through the estate windows like water over glass, soft and cold. The house never slept, not really. Staff moved at dawn, chefs rattled pans in the kitchen, and gardeners clipped hedges with the discipline of soldiers. I had risen before all of them, sitting in the east garden with a cup of bitter coffee, the bracelet cool around my wrist. From here, the house looked almost innocent, its white walls glowing, its terraces shining. But I had learned long ago that beauty often disguised the battlefield, and this house had its battle lines drawn carefully. By the time I returned inside, Charlotte was already rehearsing with the photographer. She stood under the archway of roses, tilting her head just enough to catch the light. Jonathan stood nearby, straight-backed, watching with a patience that looked practiced. His suit jacket hung open, his hands clasped loosely in front of him, but the stillness of his posture reminded me of men standing in formation. I paused in the hallway, half-shadowed, watching him. He sensed it almost instantly. His head turned, his gaze sliding across the room until it landed on me. It was not a casual glance, not the distracted look of a man cataloging his surroundings. It was precise, direct, a gaze that held knowledge. For a long moment, we did not move. Guests shifted around him, Charlotte posed and smiled, the photographer barked instructions. But Jonathan's eyes stayed on mine, steady and unflinching. It was the kind of look soldiers gave each other in silence, acknowledgement without words. Charlotte broke the moment without knowing she had done it. She slipped her arm around Jonathan's and pressed her cheek to his shoulder, forcing his head toward the camera. His gaze shifted reluctantly. The shutter clicked. Applause followed. I turned and walked away, pulse steady, steps measured. The afternoon pressed forward with ceremony. Guests toured the gardens, murmured appreciation for the wine selection, gossiped about politics and markets. I drifted among them like smoke, present but not held, listening more than speaking. Near the fountain, a woman in emerald silk leaned toward me. "You must be Charlotte's sister," she said brightly. "It is such a pity we never see you in the family photographs." Her smile was too polished to be genuine. "Maybe I was taking the picture," I said. She laughed politely, not sure whether it was a joke, and excused herself to join a cluster of men discussing investments. The words should not have mattered, but they lodged in my chest like grit, always cropped, always erased. They thought absence was harmless, but absence had weight. At dinner, I sat once again near the kitchen door. A silver dome covered each plate, lifted in unison by servers trained to vanish as soon as they had delivered. Jonathan sat across the room at Charlotte's side. She kept her hand on his arm as though to remind everyone he belonged to her, but he kept looking at me. Not constantly, just enough. A flicker across the table, the corner of his mouth tightening, his posture shifting a fraction when our eyes met. No one else noticed, or if they did, they chose not to. Halfway through the second course, Charlotte followed his gaze and caught him. Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second, then returned brighter than before. She squeezed his arm and leaned close to whisper. He nodded, eyes back on his plate, but I had seen it. She was watching now. After the meal, lanterns lit the gardens again, drawing the guests outside. The air had cooled, carrying the scent of roses and wet stone. Laughter rose high and easy. I remained at the edge near the fountain, my reflection fractured by ripples in the water. Jonathan approached without announcement, his footsteps muted by gravel. He stopped beside me, hands in his pockets, gaze fixed on the garden as if we were just two guests admiring the view. "You knew what would happen that night," he said quietly. I did not look at him. I guessed. Guesses don't always matter. This one did. It saved us. I traced a line across the water's surface with my fingertip, breaking the reflection of the lanterns. "You should thank whoever submitted it to command." His voice dropped lower. "But it was you." Silence stretched between us. "Yes," I admitted. Jonathan inhaled as though steadying himself. "I owe you my life." The words were too heavy to carry here. I glanced toward the crowd. Charlotte stood beneath the arch of roses, head tipped back in laughter, but her eyes kept sliding toward us, sharp and bright even in the dark. "You should go back," I said. Jonathan hesitated, then nodded once. "Sooner or later, truth breaks through." He turned and walked back into the lantern light. I stood alone, the bracelet biting into my wrist, the weight of his words pressing against the silence. The night ended with another round of photographs. Guests gathered on the steps of the house, glasses raised, smiles fixed. I stood at the edge again, half-shadowed, half-cropped. The photographer lifted his camera, adjusted the angle, and clicked. But Jonathan's gaze found me even in that moment. Not a smile, not an invitation. Just recognition, sharp and certain, as though he were telling me without words, "I see you." And for the first time, I did not look away. Morning began with the quiet clatter of preparation, that particular rhythm a big house finds when it is determined to look effortless. In the kitchen, I could hear pans meeting flame, lids lifting, water rushing into steel. In the courtyard, a hose whispered against stone. The estate had a way of making labor disappear behind fragrance and light, but sound always told the truth first. I dressed simply and walked the perimeter path before anyone could decide where I should stand. Dew slicked the grass and jeweled the hedges, and for a little while the place looked honest. At the far corner, I stopped beside the old cypress that had somehow escaped the gardener's obsession with symmetry. Its trunk twisted on itself like a memory refusing to straighten. I rested my palm against the bark and felt the faint shiver of wind run through the wood. By the time I returned, the house had begun to speak in polite voices. A florist carried in a second wave of roses. The planner argued softly with a man about the angle of a rented arch. Charlotte's laughter floated through the sunroom and wrapped itself around sentences like ribbon. I paused at the doorway and watched her assign roles with a smile. When she saw me, the smile did not change, but the angle of it did. "You have a quiet face today," she said. "Let us give you something to do. You can guide guests to the garden. It will keep the flow smooth." She did not wait for an answer. Instruction had already become history in her mind. I stepped aside to allow a server to pass, and then followed the corridor that led to the main hall. The marble was cool through the soles of my shoes. At the entry table, the same frame greeted me, Charlotte and Jonathan in perfect balance, the brass plaque below repeating its lesson about gratitude. I reached out and set the frame back by half a finger width. The adjustment made the reflection of the chandelier sit squarely on the glass. It was a small act. It made the picture truer. Guests began to arrive early, drawn by the promise of a day that would end in a story they could recount later as if it had always belonged to them. I stood near the threshold and directed them toward the garden with the same calm I would have used to send a convoy down the safer road. Most thanked me without seeing me. A few searched for my name and failed. My father came down the stairs with care, as if he were practicing a dignified descent for a camera that might appear at any moment. When he reached me, he stopped, hesitated, and then patted my shoulder once. The gesture landed like a note torn from a longer letter. "You know where you are seated," he said. "Near the kitchen door," I said. "It is practical," he answered, relieved that I had given him the word. Then he lifted his chin and went to find his friends from the club. Inside the garden gates, a string quartet tested a waltz. The players wore expressions of serenity that could only be built through repetition. I watched their bows rise and fall together and thought about how many hours it takes to make synchronization look like ease. Out on the lawn, a photographer directed a cousin to turn his body a fraction and lift his chin. The cousin obeyed with the open willingness of someone who believes the record matters more than the moment. A shadow moved across the flagstones. Jonathan stepped into the light, jacket over his shoulder, tie loosened. I registered the details the way a habit registers breath. Sleeves rolled to the elbow, watch face turned inward, shoulders set not to impress but to brace. He did not look at me at once. He looked at the arch, at the line of chairs, at the gap between the hedge and the tent where the wind could push a gust across the aisle. It is a particular skill to scan for problems without making the scan look like fear. I knew it well. When his eyes found mine, they stayed there a moment longer than politeness requires. He gave the slightest dip of his head, a gesture so economical it would not exist for anyone who was not looking. I felt the bracelet warm against my skin in response, the old compass answering to a signal it knew. Charlotte arrived beside him in an arc of silk. She touched his sleeve with 2 fingers and smiled up into his face, then followed his gaze and found me. For the span of a blink, she did not move. Then the smile widened brighter, as if the sun had come out just for the photo she carried around in her mind. "You should be in the garden," she said to me pleasantly. "Guests will need direction. Also, the barrels by the path are uneven. People will notice." "I noticed," I said. "They are already even." Her teeth touched the inside of her lip, quick and small, before the smile returned. "Wonderful," she said. "Then do check the place cards. Mother says the calligraphy is almost perfect." Almost. I nodded and walked away. Behind me, I heard the thin scrape of her heel pivoting on stone as she turned Jonathan back toward the arch. The hours bent into one another. I checked place cards and returned a few to their proper rows. I showed a child where the lemonade was and taught him to carry the cup with both hands. I directed an aunt to a quieter chair near the back where her knee would not ache. All of it small work, all of it steadying. The thing about being placed at the margins is that the margins touch everything. Later, in the shaded corridor outside the study, I stopped because the door was half open and the room beyond it was dim and unoccupied. The air smelled faintly of leather and paper. On the desk lay a folder, brown and unmarked except for a crease across one corner. I should have walked past. Instead, I listened. Footsteps moved away toward the kitchen, voices went with them, and silence settled like dust. I stepped inside. Within the folder, pages waited in a careful stack. Not the original, but a copy. The lines of my handwriting ran clean across the paper, the numbers marching down the margin, the map keys annotated in a hand that had learned to think inside grids. At the bottom of the 3rd page, a familiar angled script cut through my neatness. This saved us. I pressed 2 fingers to the words as if touch could read ink like Braille. When I looked up, my reflection floated in the dark window. A second reflection stood beside it. Jonathan stayed in the doorway with his palm against the frame. He had moved like a man used to making noise mean nothing. "You kept a copy in this house," I said. I did not make it a question. "I kept proof," he said, "in case the truth ever needed a door." My throat tightened. "Doors in this house do not open. They are posed." He came farther in, closed the folder, and placed his hand flat on it as if to pledge. "I cannot change how they stage their lives. I can choose where I stand in a room." "And where is that?" I asked, "today?" "With what is true," he said, "even if the timing is terrible." Footsteps scuffed in the corridor, quick and certain. Charlotte's voice arrived first, wrapped in satin. "There you are," she said to Jonathan, and then to me with warmth that did not bend. "We were just talking about you. Someone asked what you do now that you are done with all that intense training." I looked at her. "I notice." She tilted her head, inviting the room to laugh. No one did. There was no audience but the three of us. The silence made her blink. It was the smallest blink, but a blink all the same. "We should go," she said lightly, tugging at Jonathan's sleeve. "They want us for the rehearsal pass." Jonathan did not move at once. His hand lifted from the folder as if released from a weight. For a second our eyes held, and in that second I understood that he had made a decision he would not be able to tuck back into a drawer. They left. I counted to 5. Then I slid the folder back to the exact position where I found it and walked out into the hall. The air felt different, thinner, as if the house had lost a degree of pressure. In the late afternoon, the rehearsal turned into a garden gathering. I took my assigned seat and let the scene wash over me. Marilyn practiced her toast. Father practiced his smile. Cousins practiced the full body nod that means I am listening and also thinking of myself. The string quartet found a sweet, forgettable melody and held it without effort. Nothing terrible happened. The day simply wore itself closer to evening, but Charlotte was watching me now the way a cat watches a closed box. Not fearful yet. Calculating. She cornered me at the edge of the terrace while guests admired a tower of pastel macarons. "You know," she said, arranging her tone into something like sisterly advice, "you could be happier here if you would just choose to be. People respond to warmth. They want to see you smile." I took a breath and let it out slowly. "People respond to truth," I said. "They want to see it even when they do not." "Truth," she repeated, as if tasting a spice she could not place. "Truth is a luxury. The rest of us have to live with appearances. It is how things work." "It is how your things work," I said. "Mine work differently." She lifted her chin. "You like to feel superior when you stand outside it, but your seat is at my table tonight and you will respect that." "Seating charts are not ownership," I said. "They are roots." Her eyes narrowed the slightest amount. Then she smiled again, perfect and flat. "Smile for me, please," she said. "For once." I did not. I let the moment sit between us, a still thing that would not move until one of us touched it. She was the first to step back. She left with her posture even straighter than it had been, which is what people do when they have not found a better plan. When the sky shifted to a deeper blue, lanterns woke across the lawn. Guests drifted toward the dining room for the first formal service of the night. I followed the stream and took my place near the door that swung to the kitchen. It gave me the angle I wanted. I could watch the whole room and still be no one. Dinner began as dinners do, with the chore of being charming. I fulfilled my quota by thanking a server and moving a pitcher before it spilled. My father stood to toast Charlotte's business success and her relentless focus, which he declared a family trait. I watched the words choose him rather than the other way around. When he sat, he avoided my eyes. It must have been a relief for him to miss. Marilyn rose next. She praised grace and generosity and partnership, and then put a hand on Charlotte's shoulder with the precision of a ceremony she had rehearsed in the mirror. People hummed approval. Glasses lifted. The quartet set its bow tips in a bright agreement. Charlotte stood last. She spoke about seasons and gratitude and the journey of becoming, and when she said the word journey, she did not look at me. She described the evening as a movement toward the future and thanked everyone for their part in bringing light to it. She left just enough pause for the photographer to catch the soft dip of her head. The room basked. It is easy to bask when nothing is asked of you. Jonathan remained seated, still and contained, as if saving his breath for whether he knew was coming. When he finally rose, he did not lift his glass at once. He set his palms on the table as if steadying himself in rough water. Conversation quieted by degree. The quartet stopped with a soft scrape. "Before dessert," he said, voice level, "I want to acknowledge something." Charlotte's profile held its shape, but her pupils widened. She turned toward him with the grace of a dancer who has missed a cue. "I want to acknowledge work that is not seen," he said. "I want to acknowledge lives that returned home because someone did their thinking when no one was watching." He did not look at me then. He looked at the room, giving them time to decide whether they felt generous. A murmur went around the table, confusion mixed with the need to agree. My pulse did not quicken. Training is a quiet thing. It settles the air around your bones. Jonathan lifted his glass, but his eyes came to me and stayed. There was nothing theatrical in it, only recognition. Charlotte drew breath to speak, perhaps to rescue the script, but she did not get the chance. The manager of the string quartet, a man with the posture of a former captain and the hair of a man who had stopped caring about appearances, stood at the back wall. He did not clap. He simply stood, hands at his sides, attention locked on me as if he had found a frequency he thought he had lost. Someone else rose. A guest I had noticed earlier, the set of his shoulders too straight to be corporate. He faced me and gave a brief nod. Not a salute, not yet, a readiness. The room felt it before it understood it. I did not move. I let the air thin. I let the sound drain. There is a moment before a breach where everyone knows and no one admits. We were standing inside that moment. Charlotte's smile tried to hold. It trembled at the edges like sugar glass. Marilyn reached for her napkin and missed the corner. My father's jaw worked once, twice, as if he were chewing a question he had never allowed himself to ask. Jonathan lowered his glass without drinking. His eyes did not leave mine. "Tomorrow we celebrate," he said. "Tonight we recognize." Then he sat. The quartet did not resume. The room did not exhale. We were suspended, the whole house held up by something thinner than honesty and stronger than habit. I reached for my water and tasted nothing. The bracelet rested against bone, cool and exact. I thought of the folder in the study, of the words written in a hand that had learned to survive decisions. This saved us. Charlotte recovered first. She stood and laughed, a bright sound that made the silence seem like a joke we had all agreed to keep. She gestured to the servers, who rushed to deliver dessert, and the clink of porcelain became a bridge to the next part of the evening. The bridge held, but I could feel the river underneath it. The current had changed. When the plates were cleared, guests flowed toward the hall for one more photograph under the chandelier. I remained seated until the path thinned. As I rose, Jonathan came to stand beside me with the calm of a man who has reached a decision and now intends to stand with it. "Whatever happens next," he said quietly, "you are not unseen." "That is not the same as being safe," I said. "I know," he said. We walked toward the hall. The chandelier scattered light across the marble like fragments of something once whole. The photographer lifted his camera and called for family, then for extended family, then for those who loved the idea of family. People arranged themselves into shapes that looked permanent. I stopped at the edge of the frame where I had always been placed. The old reflex tried to tug me a step backward. I stayed where I was. Jonathan took his place beside Charlotte and did not look away from the lens. When the shutter clicked, 1,000 shards of light jumped. In the glass I saw myself, not a sliver this time, not a shoulder, a figure at the margin that refused to vanish. When the group broke apart, Charlotte's hand found my wrist. Her nails were clean crescents against my skin. "Do not make this difficult," she whispered. I turned my wrist gently until her fingers slipped. "It already is," I said. She stepped back. Her face smoothed itself into the version she preferred. She walked away to gather laughter around her like a cloak. I stood alone for a beat longer, letting the echoes of the shutter fade. The house listened. It had listened all day. It would listen again tomorrow. The evening was almost over. The moment was almost here. I went to sleep that night with the bracelet under my palm and the feeling of the study door in my fingertips. In the dark, I pictured the room, the folder, the handwriting cutting across mine, the simple sentence that had made an exit for truth. This saved us. I woke before my alarm. I lay still, watching the light change on the ceiling, and felt the same calm I felt before a mission when the plan was simple even if the day was not. Downstairs, someone laughed. A door closed. A bottle opened. The house continued to perform itself. I rose, smoothed the bed, and dressed. I slid the bracelet into place and listened to the small click of the clasp close. It sounded like a promise. When I opened my door, the corridor was empty. At the far end, a window framed a slice of sky, pale and hard. I walked toward it and the day that waited on the other side. The ground had already begun to move. I could feel it in my ankles, in my breath, in the quiet space behind my ribs where fear used to try to live. It was not fear now. It was recognition, growing outward from a point that could not be erased. By dusk, the room would know my name. Not the misspelled one, not the one written for someone easier to manage. By dusk, the room would be looking where it had never looked before. And I would be there, steady, ready, unhidden, prepared to receive nothing, and prepared to receive the truth that belonged to me. The day of the engagement celebration arrived with air heavy enough to press against skin. Clouds moved slow and dense across the sky, as if the weather itself had been instructed to proceed in ceremony. Inside the estate, staff hurried like whispers, setting glasses in perfect rows, tightening ribbons, aligning candles so straight they looked measured with a compass. I stood at the top of the staircase for a moment, half in shadow, watching the machine move. Guests in polished suits stepped out of cars that gleamed like trophies. Women in dresses, the color of precious stones, swept up the walkway with laughter pitched for others to hear. Every sound was part of a score rehearsed for months. Downstairs, Charlotte drifted like a conductor. She touched each detail as though it were her own reflection. Jonathan followed, his posture calm but not careless. Even from the landing I could feel his awareness scan the room, catch edges, measure distances. When his gaze flicked up and found me, it held long enough that my chest tightened. Then Charlotte touched his sleeve, pulling him back into orbit. I descended, the bracelet snug on my wrist, the clasp a reminder of what had been hidden. No one greeted me at the door. No one asked me to pose. I slid quietly into the margins where they had always wanted me, where I could see without being seen. The ceremony began in the garden. Lanterns swung gently overhead, casting honey light on the faces turned toward Charlotte. She stood beneath the arch of roses, glowing as if she had been carved from the evening itself. Jonathan stood beside her, hands clasped, gaze steady. Marilyn spoke first, her voice smooth as porcelain. She praised family, legacy, and the grace of her daughter. Applause bloomed. My father followed, telling a story about Charlotte's focus, about how she had always been destined for moments like this. Guests nodded in agreement, their eyes bright with the pleasure of being right about the world. The string quartet's melody lilted, glass clinks punctuating the rhythm. I sat near the kitchen entrance again, invisible as designed. A staff boy passed behind me carrying a tray that trembled in his hands. I steadied it with a fingertip and he whispered thank you without looking at my face. Charlotte raised her glass next, her smile the sharp edge of glass itself. She spoke of gratitude, of journeys, careful to make the words sound like poetry, not like my name. She promised a future of light, of honor, of building on the foundations given to her. Cameras clicked. Guests leaned forward, ready to be captured in her orbit. Applause swelled. And then Jonathan stood. At first, no one noticed. He moved with the quietness of a soldier rising from cover, but the silence that followed him grew too loud to ignore. He set his glass on the table instead of lifting it, palms flat on the wood as if bracing against a storm. "I want to acknowledge something," he said. The air tightened. Charlotte's smile faltered, then fixed itself brighter. "I want to acknowledge work that is never seen, lives that returned because someone made decisions in silence when no one was watching." The room froze, unsure how to react. A murmur passed, hesitant. He let it fade. Then his eyes found me. He did not look away. Charlotte's hand touched his arm, light as silk. Her nails pressed faintly against his sleeve. He did not turn. He lifted his hand slowly, fingers straight, palm firm, a gesture older than the roses, older than the house. He saluted. Gasps rippled through the tables. Glasses wavered. A fork clattered against porcelain and did not recover. "General Pratt," Jonathan said, his voice carrying through the stunned air. "I failed to salute you earlier. Forgive me." The words detonated without noise. The guests stared, eyes widening, bodies shifting. Charlotte's smile cracked for real this time, the corners trembling. My father's jaw locked. Marilyn's glass paused midair. And then from the back of the room, another figure rose. A man with the posture of service, hair gone silver, face carved by lines of command. He saluted too. One by one, others followed. Quietly, steadily, until the garden, built for photographs, became a silent formation facing me. The salute hung in the air longer than any sound could. A gesture meant to be precise and fleeting became a chasm of silence no one knew how to cross. Dozens of eyes shifted toward me, their faces reflecting shock, confusion, the sudden terror of realizing they had missed the truth standing in front of them all along. I did not move. Training steadied me, rooted me. My breath came even and slow, shoulders square though I had not willed them to be. The bracelet against my wrist felt like a seal breaking, an oath kept alive through years of silence. Charlotte's laugh cut through, brittle and too high. "Jonathan," she said, her voice honey over glass, "you always have such a flair for drama." She lifted her glass and forced the guests to follow her cue. "We are here for joy, not military rituals." But the room did not follow. A hesitation spread, wide and visible, until every guest who had begun to raise their glass found themselves lowering it again. The soldiers remained standing, their salutes unwavering. Jonathan stayed upright, eyes still locked on me, his expression calm but resolute. I could feel the ground shift beneath us. My father cleared his throat, loud and awkward, as if noise could rebuild the script. "We should return to the program," he said, his voice thin. Charlotte was about to. "No," Jonathan interrupted, his voice measured. Charlotte was not about to acknowledge what needed to be acknowledged. I was. Every word cracked the air. Charlotte's cheeks flushed, her grip on the glass tightening. "This is my engagement," she hissed, though too many heard it to count as private. "Not your theater." Jonathan turned his head slightly toward her, enough to acknowledge her words but not enough to yield. "It is your celebration. But celebrations without truth are hollow." Gasps scattered like sparks. Guests shifted in their chairs, unsure whether to applaud or escape. Marilyn rose abruptly, her chair scraping the stone patio. "Enough," she said sharply, her voice carrying like a command. This evening is for family, for appearances. Let us not ruin it with distractions. Her eyes landed on me, cold and cutting, as though I had conjured the moment. As though my very presence had dragged the truth out into the open. But Jonathan spoke again, quiet enough that the silence had to lean closer to hear. It was never a distraction. It was the foundation, and you cannot build a future by erasing the one who made it possible. The soldiers in the back did not sit. They kept their salutes steady, their arms trembling slightly but not breaking. I let the silence stretch a beat longer, then stood. Not hurried, not defensive, simply rising as though my body had waited years for the command to move. My chair scraped softly, not sharply, against the patio stone. I lifted my chin and allowed my gaze to sweep the room, touching faces that refused to meet mine, lingering on those that did. "I do not need a salute," I said finally, voice steady. "I never did, but I will not apologize for the work I have done, nor will I allow anyone to decide that silence makes me invisible." The words carried farther than I expected. They filled the lantern light, threaded through the roses, echoed against the walls. Charlotte stared at me, mouth slightly open, as though searching for the line that would restore her script. My father lowered his gaze to his plate. Marilyn sat slowly, her hands tight around the stem of her glass. Jonathan lowered his salute last, his arm falling to his side with the finality of a decision made. Whispers rippled. Guests leaned close to one another, voices low but urgent, questions buzzing through the garden like hornets. "General? Report? What does she mean? Why didn't anyone say?" I stepped back toward the edge of the patio, reclaiming my place at the margin, but no longer invisible. Every eye tracked me now, even when they tried to look away. The string quartet fumbled, began to play again, notes thin and scattered until they found their line. The music felt like an afterthought, a weak bandage over a wound that had already bled. Charlotte forced a laugh, clinked her glass against Jonathan, and turned to the crowd. "Well," she said too brightly, "wasn't that something? Let us move on with dessert, shall we?" But the applause that followed was slow, hesitant, a scattering of claps that died almost as soon as they began. The night had cracked, and nothing she did could smooth it back together. I stood in the lantern light, calm and steady, watching the family I had known all my life try to wrestle the truth back into silence. But silence, once broken, does not heal the same. The salute had shattered the script, and the story of this family would never be the same again. The morning after the salute felt strangely quiet, as if the house itself had lost the confidence to rehearse. No gardeners clipped hedges, no photographers fussed with frames. The kitchen still worked, of course, but the clatter of pans was muffled, restrained. Even the staff moved with softer steps, avoiding the spaces where truth still lingered in the air like smoke. I woke before sunrise, the bracelet cool against my wrist. I rolled it between my fingers, listening to the tiny scrape of the charm as it turned. For years I had believed silence was survival, that invisibility was the only way to stay safe in this family. But last night, a single salute had undone the script they had written for me. Now the silence felt heavier than noise, impossible to put back into place. When I stepped into the corridor, I found Jonathan waiting by the window. His jacket hung over his arm, his tie undone. The dawn light cut across his profile, catching the lines at the corner of his eyes. He looked like a man who had not slept, but also like one who had chosen not to. "You should not have done it," I said. My voice was steady, but inside I could still feel the tremor of the night before. "I had to," he answered. His eyes met mine with a calm that came only from decisions that could not be unmade. "I will not live in a house where lies are celebrated and truth is hidden. I won't bind my life to that." "You've bound yourself to Charlotte," I reminded him. Jonathan shook his head. "Last night bound me to you." The words fell between us like a charge. Neither of us moved. The hallway seemed to breathe around us, every shadow bending closer. I felt the bracelet warm against my skin, as though it understood before I did. At breakfast, the family gathered as if nothing had happened. Charlotte's smile was sharp again, practiced, but her hand trembled as she lifted her cup. Marilyn complimented the croissants too brightly. My father attempted small talk about the weather, repeating the same observation twice. No one mentioned the salute. No one dared, but the guests noticed. They whispered into their coffee, glanced at me, glanced at Jonathan, glanced away again. The air hummed with questions no one would voice aloud. When I set down my fork, Charlotte turned to me with the sweetness of a blade wrapped in silk. "Journey," she said. "You seem unsettled. Perhaps you should take a walk. Clear your thoughts." "I will," I answered calmly, "once I finish eating." Her smile tightened. Jonathan's jaw flexed, his gaze dropping to his plate. My father coughed. Marilyn reached for her water. The silence that followed was louder than any argument. That afternoon, I walked the estate's farthest boundary, where the hedges gave way to fields left rough and uneven. The land felt freer there, less strangled by the desire to impress. I knelt by a patch of wild grass, pressing the bracelet into my palm. I thought of the soldiers whose lives had been tied to my analysis, of the convoys that had returned home because I had calculated the risk differently. They would never know my name, but they had lived. And Jonathan knew. That was enough for the moment. But legacy is not built on whispers. It is carved into the record, into places no one can erase. When I returned to the house, a staff member slipped a folded note into my hand. No name, no seal, just a location, the East Study. I entered quietly. Jonathan was there, standing by the desk where the folder lay. He opened it and slid the report toward me. "Keep it," he said. "It belongs to you." I hesitated, then shook my head. "If I take it, they will say I stole it. If it stays here, it remains undeniable." Jonathan studied me for a long moment, then nodded. "You are right. The truth does not need to be hidden again." He pressed the folder flat against the desk, his hand firm, as though sealing a pact. That evening, the family gathered again, this time with fewer guests. Many had left early, unwilling to linger in the aftershock of revelation. Those who remained sat stiff, polite, wary. Charlotte carried on with charm sharp enough to wound, but even she could not erase the memory of the salute. When dessert was served, Jonathan rose once more. "This family has built itself on appearance," he said, voice steady. "But I will not marry into shadows. I will not build a life on erasure." Charlotte froze, her spoon suspended above her plate. Jonathan's gaze swept the table, then landed on me. "The woman you tried to erase saved my life. That truth is not negotiable. My loyalty is with her." The room fractured. Marilyn's breath caught, my father's face drained of color. Charlotte's hand shook so violently the spoon clattered against the plate. I did not move. I simply let the silence stand. That night, I lay awake with the bracelet pressed to my heart. Legacy is not about applause or photographs. It is about the weight of truth carried forward, about refusing to disappear when disappearance is demanded. And for the first time, I believed the story of my life was no longer theirs to write. The next morning broke with a sky the color of steel. Rain threatened, but did not fall, the clouds holding their weight the way the family held theirs. I rose early again, unable to sleep, my body restless with the knowledge that something irreversible had already begun. Downstairs, the estate buzzed with half-hearted preparations. Staff whispered in corners, their eyes sliding toward me and then away. Some of them nodded with the brief, clipped acknowledgement of people who had served before. They understood more than they could say aloud. Others avoided me altogether, carrying trays higher, moving faster, as if the truth itself were contagious. At the long dining table, Charlotte appeared later than usual. Her eyes were rimmed red, though she had covered them with powder. Jonathan walked behind her, calm and quiet, a wall of resolve she could not disguise. He sat but did not take her hand. That detail was small, but it was noticed. Breakfast passed in forced conversation. Marilyn asked Jonathan about wedding plans, her tone sharp as though the question itself might tether him back. My father mumbled about business meetings, about how the family would weather any little storm. His hands shook slightly as he lifted his coffee. No one mentioned the salute. No one dared, but the silence hummed louder than words. Later, I found myself in the library. The shelves were lined with books too polished to have been read, spines uncracked, dust carefully brushed away each week. I sat at the table in the center and spread my hands across the polished wood. It was strange to be in a room meant for knowledge, knowing this family had always feared it when it came from me. Jonathan entered quietly. He carried himself differently now, shoulders relaxed, stride unhurried, like a man who had already chosen the terrain of his next battle. "They will not forgive me," he said simply. "Nor me," I replied. He leaned against the table, crossing his arms. "You can live with their silence, I cannot." I studied his face. "Then why stay?" He exhaled, long and slow. "Because truth deserves a witness, and because I will not let them erase the one who saved me." I looked down at the bracelet, fingers brushing the compass charm. "Legacy isn't built in this house, Jonathan. It's built beyond it." He nodded, as though I had confirmed what he already knew. That afternoon, I walked the grounds alone, tracing the paths I had once run as a child. I paused by the gate I used to climb, the scar still faint on my knee from the time I fell. The iron was sharper now, taller, designed to keep out not strangers, but the parts of the family they did not want to see. A car rolled past on the road beyond, tires hissing against damp pavement. For a brief moment, I imagined leaving then and there, walking past the hedges, stepping onto the road, and never looking back. But legacy is not escape. Legacy is confrontation. In the evening, the family gathered again, smaller now. Many guests had left, citing early flights, business meetings, emergencies. The truth was simpler. No one wanted to remain in a house where silence had cracked. Charlotte raised her glass once more, her voice pitched higher than usual. She thanked the remaining guests, insisted the engagement celebration had been a success, insisted that all was well. But her smile trembled at the edges, her hand shaking slightly as she spoke. When she sat, Jonathan stood. "I cannot let this end in pretense," he said. His voice was steady, unyielding. "I will not marry into erasure. Journey Pratt saved lives. That truth is not negotiable. If this family cannot recognize her, then it does not recognize me." The words detonated through the room. Marilyn froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. My father's hands clenched on the tablecloth. Charlotte's face drained of color, the smile finally gone. I did not move. I sat with my back straight, the bracelet warm against my wrist, and let the silence swell. Later, alone in my room, I packed a small bag. Not much, just enough to remind myself that leaving was always possible. I set the bracelet on top of the folded clothes, its silver glint catching the dim light. Legacy, I thought, is not something they give you. It is something you choose, and I had chosen. That night, as I closed my eyes, I felt the truth settle inside me like steel. I was no longer the invisible sister, the cropped figure at the edge of photographs. I was Journey Pratt, and my story was no longer theirs to erase. The final evening arrived with skies heavy and low, clouds pressing down as though even the weather understood the house was carrying more than it could bear. Light from the chandeliers spilled out across the gravel drive, bright and desperate, a beacon meant to convince guests that celebration still belonged here. I stood in the hallway, watching them arrive. Cars rolled in one after another, doors opening to release laughter rehearsed in transit. Women stepped out in gowns that glittered under the lamps, men in tailored suits carried themselves like metals pinned to fabric. They did not know they were stepping into a battlefield, or perhaps they knew and hoped denial would protect them. Charlotte greeted them at the door with flawless charm. Her smile had been repaired, polished, sharpened again overnight. She kissed cheeks, embraced shoulders, accepted compliments. But when her eyes flicked toward me, the warmth drained for a second too long before she recovered. Jonathan stayed close but distant, his posture neutral, his voice clipped. He shook hands, accepted congratulations, but his eyes were somewhere else, somewhere nearer to me. Inside, the dining hall had been arranged again, every surface polished, every flower arranged with care. But the cracks from the night before still lingered. Whispers threaded through the air, quieter than the clink of glass, but impossible to erase. I took my place near the edge, as always, but this time I did not bow my head. I sat straight, my eyes steady, letting the room see me even when it tried not to. Dinner began. Toasts were given again, each more desperate than the last. Marilyn spoke of unity, her words brittle with strain. My father muttered about perseverance, his glass trembling faintly in his hand. Guests clapped politely, their applause more obligation than enthusiasm. Charlotte stood last, her voice warm and practiced, weaving gratitude into performance. She spoke of family, of future, of legacy. She did not look at me once. When she sat, Jonathan rose. He did not raise his glass this time, he simply looked at the room until the murmur died. "Legacy is not built on appearances," he said. "It is built on truth, and truth cannot be erased." His eyes found mine, steady, unflinching. Journey Pratt saved lives. That name deserves to be spoken here. That name deserves to be remembered. The silence that followed was not like the night before. This silence was deeper, heavier, irreversible. Guests shifted, uncertain, unwilling to clap, but unable to dismiss what they had heard. Charlotte's face froze, her smile unable to reform. Marilyn's hand tightened around her glass until her knuckles whitened. My father stared at his plate, unable to meet my eyes. I stood. Slowly, deliberately, I let the weight of my name fill the space. "I am Journey Pratt," I said. "I was invisible because it was easier for you, but invisibility is not the same as absence. I was here all along. And I am here now." My voice carried farther than I intended. It reached the back of the room where the veterans stood again, the same men who had saluted before. One by one they rose, this time not all saluted. Some simply said my name, softly, clearly, Journey Pratt. Each repetition struck like a bell. Charlotte tried to laugh it away. "This is absurd," she snapped, her mask cracking. "She is making this entire night about herself." But no one joined her, not this time. The weight had shifted. I felt my pulse steady, calm spreading through me like steel. For the first time, I was not the cropped figure at the edge of the frame. I was the subject. I was the name. I lowered my eyes briefly, the bracelet warm against my wrist, then lifted my gaze again. "You cannot erase me," I said softly, but it carried. "You cannot crop me out anymore." The truth settled into the room like stone. Even those who wished to deny it could not. My name had been spoken. My legacy had been claimed. And nothing could return the silence to what it once was. The air in the dining hall had changed. Lanterns reflected off the polished floors, flickering against faces that were suddenly unguarded. The room that had once seemed like a stage for Charlotte's perfection now felt like a chamber of reckoning. Guests whispered, shifting in their seats, unsure how to respond. No one moved forward to challenge the truth. The silence was theirs, no longer mine. I stepped closer to the center of the room, letting the length of the hall frame me. My posture was deliberate, strong, unyielding. The bracelet at my wrist caught the light, silver gleaming like proof that I had endured. I lifted my head, letting the words settle in the space between tables and chandeliers. "I am not an afterthought. I am not a shadow. I am Journey Pratt, and I have always been here. You may have ignored me, but I existed. I exist." A ripple passed through the room. Guests who had been polite observers now looked at me directly, recognition dawning. Even some of Charlotte's closest friends whispered amongst themselves, glances darting between the two of us, unsure how to reconcile the image before them with the narrative they had been fed. Charlotte's expression cracked fully this time. Her lips parted as if she were about to speak, to reclaim control, but no words could form. Marilyn's hands tightened on the edge of the table, trying to assert authority, but she faltered. My father's eyes avoided me, though I could feel the weight of his acknowledgement pressing down like a latent truth. Jonathan stepped forward, his movement smooth, measured. His eyes locked with mine. "You have always saved more than lives," he said. "You have saved the integrity of truth itself, and now it belongs to you." The veterans at the back rose once more, a ripple of recognition flowing through them. Some nodded, some spoke my name aloud, others simply saluted, steady and solemn. My heart remained calm, my breathing even. Finally, the house had shifted to my measure, and I was no longer at the mercy of their construction of reality. Charlotte tried again to reclaim control. "This is ridiculous," she shouted. "You are turning this into a spectacle." I allowed a faint smile. "It was always a spectacle of your own making. I am simply stepping into it now with my name intact." The guests murmured, some nodding, some whispering, all witnessing a rupture they could not ignore. The room, once aligned for perfection, had been rearranged by the force of truth. The air itself felt lighter, yet heavier, the weight of unspoken years settling finally into acknowledgement. Jonathan offered his hand, small and careful. "Together," he said softly, "we make sure it is never erased again." I took his hand briefly, letting the gesture mark the closure of years of invisibility. For the first time, I felt the permanence of recognition not as a gift, but as something claimed. The bracelet warmed against my skin, the compass pointing firmly forward. As the evening faded into night, I moved through the room with presence, letting the guests adjust to the reality that I had been more than they imagined. Photographers finally captured me fully, not as a background shadow, not as a sliver in the corner. Every flash, every angle, recognized the figure I had always been. Charlotte retreated to the far side of the hall, silent, attempting control through distance. Her laughter had vanished, replaced with a calculated quiet. My father remained seated, muted, processing the shift. Marilyn's attempts to regain decorum were feeble. I paused by the grand staircase, letting the moment imprint itself. Lanterns glimmered. The chandelier cast fragments of light. The room held its breath, not for Charlotte or for anyone else, but for the presence I had claimed. "I am here," I whispered to no one but myself, and yet the words echoed through the hall. "I am Journey Pratt. My story is mine, and it will not be erased." The guests, the house, the family, they all knew it now. There was no reversal. My legacy was no longer silent, no longer hidden, no longer someone else's to control. I was present, fully, unmistakably, irreversibly. Outside, the sky had cleared. Stars pricked the night with silver light. I walked to the terrace, feeling the cool stone beneath my feet. The bracelet caught the moonlight for one last gleam, steady and unwavering. Every step I took forward was a step claimed, a step that no one could take back. This was the culmination. The weight of names, the power of acknowledgement, the endurance of truth. I had survived erasure. I had claimed recognition. I had transformed invisibility into presence, and I would never return to the shadows again.